He thought he held the world in the palm of his blood-stained hand. Arthur Costello, the undisputed head of the Denver syndicate, wiped the scent of expensive perfume off his collar and unlocked the heavy mahogany door to his Oak Brook estate. He expected to find his heavily pregnant wife, Josephine, asleep in their silk sheets, blissfully ignorant and unconditionally loyal. He expected his empire to be secure, his secrets buried, and his sins erased by the sheer magnitude of his power. He was entirely wrong. The sprawling mansion was pitch black, the silence was deafening, and Josephine wasn't waiting to welcome him home, she was waiting to bury him. The Costello name commanded absolute respect, and a healthy dose of sheer terror across the entire Midwest. Arthur Costello had inherited a fractured organization from his father, but within 5 years, he had ruthlessly transformed it into a modern corporate empire built on a foundation of extortion, illicit gambling, and high-end racketeering. He was 34, impeccably tailored, and possessed a charismatic cruelty that made men kneel and women swoon. But an empire requires an heir, and for that, Arthur needed a queen. Josephine Rossi had been the perfect candidate, the daughter of the late, highly respected Carlo Rossi. Her bloodline was Mafia royalty. Their marriage, forged in the fires of a syndicate peace treaty 5 years prior, was supposed to be a purely strategic alliance. Yet, to the outside world, they were the picture of devastating glamour. Josephine Josie, to the few she trusted, was a woman of quiet, terrifying intelligence, possessing a classical beauty that served as the perfect armor. She played the role of the dutiful philanthropist mafia wife to perfection. She turned a blind eye to the late-night meetings, the sudden disappearances of rival bosses, and the blood that inevitably splattered onto the cuffs of Arthur's custom Tom Ford suits. When Josie finally fell pregnant, the Denver underworld breathed a collective sigh of relief. An heir meant stability. For Arthur, the impending arrival of his son was the ultimate validation of his God complex. He became fiercely protective, confining Josie to their sprawling, high-security Oak Brook estate, surrounding her with armed guards led by his right-hand man, Thomas Rinaldi. Arthur treated her like a fragile, sacred vessel, entirely dismissing the razor-sharp mind that resided within her. It was this arrogant underestimation that would ultimately be his undoing. Power breeds a very specific kind of boredom, and Arthur was a man who constantly needed to be stimulated by danger. His empire ran like a well-oiled machine, his wife was safely locked away in a golden cage, and so, Arthur sought out chaos. He found it in Chloe Harrington. Chloe was 23, the rebellious daughter of a prominent Illinois state senator who owed the Costello family a substantial amount of money. She was reckless, volatile, and intoxicated by the proximity to genuine, lethal power. What started as a power play, Arthur manipulating the senator through his daughter, quickly morphed into a toxic, consuming affair. Chloe didn't care about the rules of the underworld. She texted him at all hours, left traces of her signature jasmine perfume in his armored SUV, and demanded his time with the petulant entitlement of a spoiled child. Arthur, blinded by his own invincibility, grew sloppy. He believed he was untouchable. He believed Josephine, now 8 months pregnant, swollen, and supposedly exhausted, was too consumed by impending motherhood to notice the shifting tectonic plates of her marriage. The revelation didn't come to Josie through a tearful confession or a dramatic confrontation. It arrived quietly, nestled inside a mundane stack of mail. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The estate manager was out sick, and Josie, seeking a distraction from the heavy, aching weight of her 3rd trimester, sorted through the courier deliveries. Among the thick envelopes of corporate documents was a sleek, black envelope from a prestigious Gold Coast jeweler. It was addressed to Arthur's private holding company, but the delivery instructions explicitly named a penthouse address on Lakeshore Drive, a property Josie knew belonged to Senator Harrington. The invoice detailed a custom-made, teardrop diamond necklace, engraved with the initials C.H. Josie, stood in the center of her massive, sunlit kitchen. She didn't gasp. She didn't cry. The expected wave of heartbreak never materialized. Instead, a chilling, absolute stillness washed over her. She looked at the receipt, her mind instantly connecting the dots. The faint scent of jasmine Arthur tried to wash away with strong scotch, the sudden emergency union meetings that kept him away until dawn, the subtle shift in Thomas Rinaldi's eyes when he looked at her pity. The men guarding her weren't just protecting her, they were keeping her contained while Arthur paraded a politician's daughter around the city. She rested a hand on her swollen stomach, feeling the strong, rhythmic kick of her unborn son. Arthur had broken the one unspoken rule of their marriage. He had made a fool of her. In the world they inhabited, disrespect was entirely synonymous with a death sentence. "You think I am weak because I carry your child, Arthur," Josie whispered to the empty room, her voice devoid of any warmth. "But you forgot who my father was." Josie didn't confront him when he returned home that night. She watched as Arthur walked into the master bedroom, shedding his suit jacket, walking over to press a tender kiss to her forehead before kneeling to kiss her stomach. "How is my king doing today?" Arthur murmured, his voice laced with an affection that made Josie's blood run cold. "He's restless," Josie replied, her face a mask of serene exhaustion, just like his father. Arthur smiled, completely oblivious to the venom hidden beneath her words. He took a shower to wash off the scent of Chloe, completely unaware that the woman waiting for him in bed had just decided to dismantle his entire universe. The first phase of Josephine's revenge required absolute discipline. She had to swallow her disgust, play the role of the adoring hormonal wife, and use Arthur's own security apparatus against him. She knew that confronting him would only lead to gaslighting, tightened security, and potentially danger to herself and her child. Arthur was a narcissist. If he felt his empire was threatened by the mother of his heir, there was no telling how ruthless he might become. Josie began her work in the shadows of the night. Her father, Carlo Rossi, hadn't just taught her how to hold a gun. He had taught her the intricate, invisible architecture of Mafia money. He had taught her that blood builds an empire, but money is the only thing that sustains it. Arthur was notoriously paranoid, keeping his digital ledgers on an encrypted server in his home office, a room protected by biometric locks. But Arthur also possessed a fatal flaw: his ego. He genuinely believed his wife was technologically illiterate. He never noticed that the decorative silver compact mirror Josie frequently left on his desk was, in fact, a high-resolution, wide-angle recording device. Within a week, Josie had the passcode to his primary encrypted drive. Late at night, while Arthur slept off the exhaustion of running a syndicate and managing a high-maintenance mistress, Josie would quietly slip into his office. Her pregnant belly made her movements slow and cumbersome, but her mind worked with lethal efficiency. She began copying gigabytes of data onto untraceable, encrypted USB drives. She found everything: the routing numbers for the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus, the blackmail files Arthur held on local judges and police commissioners, the shipment schedules for the illegal narcotics he was secretly moving through the docks, a direct violation of the commission's rules. But destroying his money and his freedom wasn't enough. Josie wanted to destroy his power on the streets. To do that, she needed an inside man. She turned her attention to Thomas Rinaldi. Tommy was a seasoned enforcer, fiercely loyal to the Costello family, but he was an old-school mobster. He believed in honor, in the sanctity of the family, and he deeply respected Josie's late father. He also harbored a deep, quiet disgust for Arthur's recklessness with Chloe Harrington, recognizing that the senator's daughter was a massive liability. Josie chose her moment perfectly. It was a rainy Thursday, and Arthur was out handling union disputes. Tommy was standing watch in the estate's library. Josie entered, carrying a tray with 2 cups of espresso. "You look tired, Tommy," she said softly, setting a cup down near him. Tommy offered a respectful nod. "Just the weather, Mrs. Costello. You shouldn't be carrying trays in your condition." "My condition," Josie repeated, a bitter edge to her voice. She sat heavily in a leather armchair. "Tommy, you served my father for 10 years before you came to Arthur." "I did. He was a great man." Josie locked eyes with him, stripping away the facade. "My father would never have jeopardized his family for a 23-year-old civilian." Tommy froze. The espresso cup halfway to his mouth stopped in mid-air. He didn't confirm it, but the sudden tension in his jaw told Josie everything she needed to know. "I know about Chloe Harrington, Tommy," Josie said, her voice a lethal whisper. "And I know about the narcotics shipments through the South Side docks, the shipments Arthur hid from the New York Commission." Tommy's face drained of color. "Mrs. Costello." "I don't need you to betray him, Tommy," Josie interrupted, her eyes boring into his. "I need you to survive the fallout. Because when the commission finds out about the drugs, and when the feds receive the ledgers, the Costello family will burn. I am protecting my son. Will you help me ensure the right people are out of the blast radius when the bomb goes off?" Tommy looked at the pregnant woman before him, He saw the terrifying ghost of Carlo Rossi in her eyes. He knew, in that exact second, that Arthur Costello was already a dead man walking. "What do you need me to do, Josie?" he asked, using her first name for the first time in years. With Tommy quietly redirecting Arthur's loyalists and securing Josie's escape routes, she made her most dangerous move. She reached out to Liam O'Connor. Liam was the ruthless head of the Irish faction, a man Arthur had recently humiliated and marginalized during a territory dispute over the city's construction contracts. Josie arranged a meeting through a heavily encrypted burner phone, meeting Liam's right-hand man in the back of an anonymous town car outside a prenatal clinic. She handed over a single flash drive containing the exact schedules, guard rotations, and security codes for Arthur's 3 largest illegal casinos. It was a blood offering. In exchange, Liam O'Connor agreed to provide the muscle and the absolute chaos Josie needed for her grand finale. All the while, Arthur suspected nothing. He bought Josie a spectacular diamond tennis bracelet to celebrate her entering the final month of her pregnancy. He sat at the dinner table, drinking Barolo wine, complaining about the stress of his business, completely blind to the fact that the woman serving him pasta was quietly, methodically dismantling his entire existence. The annual Denver Children's Hospital Charity Gala was the premier event of the season. Held in the grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel, it was the one night a year where the city's legitimate elite rubbed shoulders with its most powerful underworld figures under the guise of philanthropy. Arthur Costello was in his element. Dressed in a bespoke tuxedo, he worked the room like a politician, shaking hands with judges, clinking glasses with real estate moguls, and asserting his dominance over the room. He felt utterly invincible. Josie stood by his side, radiating an otherworldly, terrible beauty. She wore a floor-length, midnight blue maternity gown that clung to her curves, her dark hair swept up in an elegant chignon. She played the doting wife, smiling for the photographers, accepting compliments on her glowing complexion. No one could see the ice water running through her veins. Tonight was the night. The tension in the room shifted imperceptibly around 10 o'clock. Josie felt it before she saw it. Chloe Harrington had arrived. Chloe was not supposed to be there, but Arthur's mistress was drunk on her own perceived importance, entirely delusional about her status. She wore a scandalous red silk dress that left very little to the imagination, and around her neck hung the teardrop diamond necklace Josie had seen the receipt for weeks ago. Arthur's jaw tightened when he spotted her near the champagne fountain. He shot a frantic, angry look at his security detail, but they were already instructed by Tommy to let the drama unfold. Josie watched the panic flash in her husband's eyes. "Is something wrong, Arthur?" she asked smoothly, taking a sip of sparkling water. "Just a business associate I need to have a quick word with," Arthur muttered, his composure slipping. "Excuse me for a moment, my love." As Arthur hurried to intercept Chloe and drag her into a secluded alcove, Josie casually glided through the crowd. She wasn't about to let this moment pass. She timed her approach perfectly, stepping into the dimly lit hallway just outside the powder room, where Arthur had just left a pouting Chloe to cool off. Chloe turned, startled, as Josie approached. Up close, the younger woman looked flushed, defiant, and pathetically out of her depth. "Mrs. Costello," Chloe said, puffing out her chest, trying to project a confidence she clearly didn't possess. "Beautiful event." Josie stopped 2 feet away from her. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look angry. She simply looked at Chloe the way one might look at an insect before stepping on it. "It is a beautiful necklace, Chloe," Josie said, her voice soft, musical, and terrifying. "A teardrop diamond, 2 carats, flawless clarity, purchased on the 12th of last month." Chloe's defiance shattered instantly. The color drained from her face, her hand instinctively flying to her throat to cover the diamonds. I don't know what you're talking about." "Arthur thinks you are dangerous," Josie continued, stepping slightly closer, invading Chloe's space. "He likes the thrill of you, but you aren't dangerous, Chloe. You are just a temporary distraction, a liability." "He loves me," Chloe hissed, though her voice shook. "He's going to leave you. He only stays because of the baby." Josie actually smiled. It was a genuine, bone-chilling smile. "Oh, sweetheart, he isn't going to leave me. Because by tomorrow morning, Arthur Costello won't have anything left to leave." Josie reached out, her manicured fingers gently brushing against the diamond necklace on Chloe's skin. Chloe flinched as if burned. "Enjoy the party, Chloe. It's the last one you'll ever attend in this city." Josie turned and walked back into the ballroom, leaving the mistress trembling in the corridor. The pieces were all in place on the board. Checkmate was imminent. An hour later, Arthur returned to Josie's side, visibly agitated and sweating slightly through his tuxedo shirt. He had managed to send Chloe away, but the near miss had rattled his nerves. "Josie, darling," Arthur said, checking his gold Patek Philippe watch. "I have an urgent matter to attend to at the warehouse. A shipment issue. Tommy will take you home. I'll be back before dawn." It was the exact lie Josie had anticipated. The warehouse was Chloe's penthouse. "Of course, Arthur," Josie said softly, reaching up to adjust his silk bow tie. She looked deeply into his eyes, committing the sight of his arrogant, lying face to memory. "Be careful out there. The city is dangerous at night." "I own this city, Josephine," he scoffed softly, kissing her cheek. Josie watched him walk away, flanked by 2 bodyguards who were secretly loyal to Tommy. She turned to Tommy, who had materialized by her side. "It's time," Josie said. Tommy nodded grimly. He tapped his earpiece, uttering a single coded phrase. "The king has left the castle." As Josie stepped into the armored SUV to head back to the Oakbrook estate, she pulled out a secure tablet from her designer clutch. With a few deliberate taps, she initiated a cascading sequence of absolute destruction. Simultaneously, across the city, an automated email containing Arthur's encrypted ledgers, offshore account passwords, and the blackmail files on city officials was sent directly to the lead prosecutor of the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force. 10 miles away, Liam O'Connor's heavily armed crews descended upon Arthur's 3 most lucrative underground casinos, smashing the doors, disarming the confused, leaderless guards, and burning the establishments to the ground. And at the very docks Arthur claimed to control, an anonymous tip directed the DEA straight to the shipping containers, holding $20 million worth of unauthorized narcotics. Arthur Costello was currently speeding toward his mistress's bed, completely oblivious to the fact that his pregnant wife had just leveled his empire to ash. The rain driving against the tinted windows of Arthur Costello's Mercedes G-Wagon mirrored the sudden, violent storm brewing in his chest. He arrived at the Lakeshore Drive penthouse with his jaw set in a hard line, his mind racing with damage control strategies. He expected to find Chloe Harrington in hysterics, throwing expensive glassware and demanding reassurances. He keyed his private code into the private elevator, the stainless steel doors sliding shut with a heavy, final thud that felt oddly like a vault locking into place. Stepping into the sprawling, multi-million-dollar apartment, Arthur was met with a suffocating silence. Chloe was sitting on the edge of a white velvet sofa, her scandalous red silk dress torn at the hem, mascara tracking deep black rivers down her flushed cheeks. She didn't look angry. She looked utterly terrified. "Arthur," she gasped, her voice trembling violently. "She knows. Your wife. She came up to me. She knew the exact carat weight of the necklace. She looked at me like I was already dead." Arthur loosened his silk bow tie, a flare of irritation cutting through his anxiety. "Josie is pregnant and hormonal. She's bluffing. She doesn't have the stomach for a real war, Chloe. I control the money. I control the men. She is nothing without my last name." He walked over to the built-in wet bar to pour himself a heavy measure of Macallan 25, dismissing his wife's intelligence with the casual arrogance of a man who believed his own myth. He took a long swallow, the amber liquid burning down his throat. Then his encrypted burner phone, the one reserved exclusively for top-tier syndicate captains, shattered the quiet. Arthur pulled it from his breast pocket. The caller ID flashed the name Vincent, his underboss who managed the Southside operations. "Yeah, Vinny." "Make it fast," Arthur snapped. "Boss." Vincent's voice was completely unrecognizable, stripped of its usual gruff confidence, and replaced by sheer, unfiltered panic. "It's gone. It's all gone." "What the hell are you talking about?" "Calm down and give me a clear report." "The River North Casino, the underground sportsbook in West Loop, the VIP poker rooms in Fulton Market. Boss, they're burning." Liam O'Connor's Irish crews just drove tactical vans through the front doors. They didn't even come to negotiate. They came with automatic weapons and incendiary grenades. "We've got men bleeding out on the pavement. The police aren't responding. Someone paid off the dispatchers." Arthur froze. The expensive crystal tumbler slipped from his fingers, shattering against the imported hardwood floor. the whiskey splashed across the toes of his hand-stitched Oxford shoes. Liam O'Connor was a nuisance, a localized threat, but he didn't have the capital or the manpower to launch a simultaneous three-pronged attack on heavily guarded Costello properties. Not unless someone had given him the blueprints, the guard rotations, and the security bypass codes. Before Arthur could formulate a response, the phone beeped with a call waiting. It was his man at the shipping docks. He clicked over. "Arthur!" The voice over the line was drowned out by the distinct, deafening wail of federal sirens and the sharp shouts of men moving in tactical formations. The docks, the DEA and the FBI Organized Crime Task Force just breached Terminal 4. They went straight for the hidden cargo containers. They didn't even search the perimeter. They knew exactly which boxes held the shipment. They have dogs, Arthur. They have everything. Arthur's blood ran completely cold. A shipment of unauthorized narcotics worth $20 million, hidden from the New York Commission, was currently being photographed by federal agents. The punishment for dealing behind the Commission's back was absolute. It was a mandatory death sentence. "Vinny," Arthur switched back to the first line, his voice dropping to a hoarse whisper. "Call Tommy Rinaldi. Tell him to secure the Oak Brook estate. Tell him to get Josie and put her on the private jet. We need to move. Boss." Vinny hesitated, the sound of crackling flames audible in the background of his call. "I tried. Tommy's radio is dark. His tracker is offline. Half the security detail at your estate just vanished. The other half said Tommy relieved them of duty an hour ago." Arthur ended the call. His hands, usually so steady, were shaking uncontrollably. He walked slowly to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Denver skyline. In the distance, cutting through the heavy rain and the fog, he could see three distinct pillars of thick, black smoke rising into the night sky. His empire was burning. He pulled out his primary smartphone and dialed his home number. It rang once, twice, and then went to a digitized voicemail. He dialed Josie's cell phone. "The number you have dialed is no longer in service." The realization hit Arthur with the kinetic force of a freight train. The timing was too perfect. The surgical precision of the attacks, the exact knowledge of the hidden docks, the sudden disappearance of his most loyal captain, Thomas Rinaldi. It wasn't Liam O'Connor. It wasn't the feds. It was Josephine, the docile, heavily pregnant wife he had left at a charity gala less than 2 hours ago, had orchestrated the systematic dismantling of his entire life. The chilling words Chloe had spoken moments ago echoed in his ears. "She looked at me like I was already dead." Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the penthouse burst open with a deafening crash, splintering off their hinges. "FBI! Nobody move! Get your hands where we can see them!" A dozen men in heavy tactical gear, led by Special Agent Robert Hayes, swarmed the living room. Red laser sights danced across Arthur's ruined tuxedo. Chloe screamed, dropping to the floor and covering her head. Arthur didn't think. Instinct, honed by years on the streets, took over. He threw himself sideways through the frosted glass door of the master bathroom, the shards slicing through his jacket. He scrambled toward the maintenance access panel behind the marble shower, a hidden escape route he had installed, for precisely this reason. He kicked the panel open, squeezed his broad shoulders into the dark, narrow ventilation shaft, and began to crawl, leaving his screaming mistress and his shattered life behind. While Arthur Costello was crawling through the dust and rat droppings of a luxury high-rise duct system, Josephine Rossi was reclining comfortably in the plush leather seat of a customized, armored Cadillac Escalade, speeding south down Interstate 55. The interior of the vehicle was quiet, save for the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers and the soft hum of the heater. Josie rested her hands on her swollen abdomen, feeling a profound, intoxicating sense of peace. The oppressive weight that had rested on her chest for months, the betrayal, the disrespect, the stifling confinement of her marriage had vanished, replaced by the cold, clear oxygen of absolute control. In the passenger seat, Thomas Rinaldi was speaking quietly into an encrypted satellite phone, coordinating the final movements of their extraction. He ended the call and turned to look over his shoulder at Josie. "The casinos are ash, Mrs. Costello," Tommy reported, his tone entirely professional, betraying no emotion over the destruction of the family he had served for years. "The FBI has secured the docks." Agent Hayes personally led the raid on the Harrington penthouse. Arthur escaped through the maintenance shafts, as expected, but his bank accounts have been frozen. The Cayman Island trusts have been drained and rerouted through the Swiss shells you set up. He has no money, no safe houses, and as of 10 minutes ago, a target on his back from the Irish. Good, Josie murmured, staring out at the blurred lights of the passing highway. And the commission? Don Domenico Vitiello is waiting for us at the private airstrip in Gary. He flew in from New York an hour ago. Josie nodded. This was the most critical juncture of her plan. You do not simply destroy a recognized mafia boss without answering to the high council that governs the underworld. To survive, Josie couldn't just be a vengeful wife. She had to be a shrewd politician. An hour later, the Escalade pulled into a deserted hangar at the Gary-Denver International Airport. A sleek Gulfstream G650 was parked on the tarmac, its engines idling with a low, menacing roar. Waiting in the shadows of the hangar was an armada of black SUVs surrounding a small, portable office structure. Josie stepped out of the vehicle. The cold night air bit at her skin, but she stood tall, ignoring the ache in her lower back. Flanked by Tommy and 4 heavily armed loyalists who had chosen the Rossi bloodline over Arthur's sinking ship, she walked into the temporary office. Sitting behind a cheap folding table, looking entirely out of place in his tailored Brioni suit, was Don Domenico Vitiello. He was a man in his late 70s, with eyes like chipped obsidian and a reputation that made hardened killers cross themselves. He did not stand when Josie entered, but he offered a slow, respectful nod. "Josephine, you look like your father. Carlo would be proud and terrified of what you have done tonight." "Don Domenico," Josie replied smoothly, taking the metal folding chair opposite him. She didn't flinch under his heavy gaze. "I assume you have received the offshore transfer." $50 million, the Don stated, his voice a gravelly rasp, deposited into the Commission's blind trust in Luxembourg. A very generous tribute. But money does not erase the fact that you ordered hits on recognized syndicate properties and colluded with the federal government to expose a shipment. "I exposed a shipment that Arthur Costello hid from this council," Josie countered, her voice ringing with absolute authority. "He brought $20 million of unauthorized narcotics into my city. He brought heat upon all our families because he was distracted by a politician's daughter. He became a liability to the commission. I merely performed the necessary surgery to remove a cancer." Don Domenico steepled his fingers, evaluating the pregnant woman before him. She possessed a terrifying, ruthless clarity that Arthur had always lacked. Arthur was a blunt instrument. Josephine was a scalpel. "And what is it you want, Josephine?" the Don asked. "You have destroyed your husband. You have the money. You could disappear to Europe tonight." "I am a Rossi," Josie said, her eyes narrowing. "I do not disappear. My son will be born in 2 weeks. He is the rightful heir to the Denver territory. I want the commission to officially excommunicate Arthur Costello. I want the protection of the 5 families. And until my son is of age, I want Thomas Rinaldi recognized as the acting boss of the Denver syndicate, operating under my direct, exclusive instruction." The room went dead silent. Tommy, standing behind Josie, tightened his grip on his weapon, anticipating a violent rejection. A woman demanding to run a territory as a shadow regent was unprecedented. Don Domenico stared at Josie for a long, agonizing minute. He weighed the $50 million, the undeniable fact that Arthur was a rogue element, and the sheer, unadulterated power radiating from Carlo Rossi's daughter. Slowly, the old man smiled. It was a chilling expression. "The Costello family is dead," Don Domenico declared, pouring a small glass of sambuca from a flask and sliding it across the table toward Josie. "Long live the Rossi family. You have our blessing, Josephine. But Arthur is still breathing. A wounded animal is the most dangerous." "Arthur is no longer my concern," Josie said, ignoring the drink and standing up. "He has no money, no men, and the entire city is hunting him. Let him drown in the flood he created." As Josie walked out of the hangar and boarded the waiting Gulfstream destined for a heavily fortified, deeply secluded estate in the Adirondack Mountains, she allowed herself a small, genuine smile. Chloe Harrington hadn't just been a mistress. She had been the perfect, fragile lever Josie needed to crack Arthur's empire wide open, and the lever had snapped beautifully. 3 days. It had only taken 72 hours for Arthur Costello to transform from the undisputed king of Denver into a desperate, hunted ghost. He was huddled in the corner of a decaying, cash-only motel room on the outskirts of Gary, Indiana. His bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo was ruined, crusted with dried blood and city grime. His left shoulder throbbed with a sickening, infected heat where a bullet from one of Liam O'Connor's hitmen had grazed him during a frantic shootout in an alleyway the previous night. Arthur was staring at a stolen burner phone, his mind unraveling. He had tried to contact his offshore bankers. His passwords had been altered, the accounts legally transferred under corporate bylaws he had blindly signed years ago at Josie's casual suggestion. He had reached out to corrupt judges he owned. They had hung up on him, terrified of the federal indictments Josie had seamlessly leaked to the press. He had nothing. The FBI wanted him for racketeering and narcotics trafficking. The Irish wanted his head on a spike for past grievances. And the commission had formally declared him persona non grata, effectively placing a multi-million-dollar bounty on his life. Pain and fever warped his perception, but one singular, burning obsession kept him moving: Josephine. He needed to look her in the eyes. He needed to understand how the woman who smiled so softly, who rubbed his shoulders and carried his child, had orchestrated his absolute annihilation. He remembered a conversation they had on their honeymoon in Lake Como. Josie had spoken fondly of her late father's private retreat, a sprawling, off-the-grid compound in the Adirondack Mountains, purchased through a blind trust that Arthur had never bothered to audit. It was the only piece of Rossi property that wasn't tied to the Costello name. It took Arthur 24 hours to steal a car, bribe an underworld doctor for a crude stitching job and a handful of painkillers, and drive continuously through the freezing rain toward upstate New York. When he finally breached the perimeter of the Adirondack estate, bypassing the initial thermal sensors through sheer desperate luck and the cover of a brutal snowstorm, he felt a twisted sense of victory. He was Arthur Costello. He survived. He jimmied the lock on a side terrace door, his hands slick with his own blood, and slipped into the massive, warmly lit mansion. The contrast to his squalor was jarring. The house smelled of lavender and burning cedar wood. He moved silently down the hallway, gripping a stolen 9mm Glock tightly in his good hand. He followed the soft golden light spilling from a room at the end of the corridor. He pushed the door open. It was a nursery. Exquisitely designed, painted in soft creams and muted golds, with a handcrafted mahogany crib resting in the center. Sitting in a plush rocking chair, looking out a massive bay window at the falling snow, was Josephine. She wore a thick cashmere robe, her dark hair cascading down her shoulders. She looked rested, radiant, and entirely unbothered. "You always were too loud, Arthur," Josie said quietly, not turning around. "Even when you try to be quiet, your ego announces your presence." Arthur stepped into the room, leveling the gun at her back. His hand was shaking violently. "You destroyed everything! Everything I built! You burned my city to the ground!" Josie finally stopped rocking. She turned her head slowly, her dark eyes locking onto his bloodshot, manic gaze. There was no fear in her expression. There was only clinical detachment, as if she were inspecting a damaged piece of furniture. "I didn't destroy anything, Arthur," she replied, her voice smooth and chillingly calm. "I merely transferred the title. Your city is currently being managed very efficiently by Tommy, under my explicit direction." Arthur gasped, the name hitting him like a physical blow. "Tommy? He betrayed me for you? For a woman?" "He didn't betray you," Josie corrected gently, standing up with careful precision to accommodate her heavy stomach. "He chose the stronger leader. You were weak, Arthur. You jeopardized $1 billion syndicate and the future of my son for the cheap thrill of a 23-year-old girl. You broke the rules. I simply enforced the penalty." "I am your husband," Arthur roared, taking a step forward, the gun trembling, his finger hovering over the trigger. "I gave you the world." "You gave me a cage," she countered, taking a step toward him, utterly ignoring the weapon pointed at her chest. "And you forgot who built the cage. My father taught me that blood makes you related, but loyalty makes you family. You showed no loyalty. Therefore, you are nothing to me." Arthur let out a ragged, agonizing sob. He wanted to pull the trigger. He wanted to end the architect of his misery. But looking at her, heavily pregnant with his heir, radiating a terrifying absolute power, he realized he was fundamentally outmatched. He wasn't the king. He had only been keeping the throne warm for her. Before Arthur could make a decision, a cold, heavy cylinder pressed against the back of his skull. "Drop it, Arthur." Thomas Rinaldi's voice rumbled from behind him, void of any former respect. Arthur's shoulders slumped. The Glock slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly onto the polished hardwood floor. He fell to his knees, the physical pain of his gunshot wound finally overwhelmed by the crushing, absolute defeat of his spirit. "What now?" Arthur whispered, staring at the floor, broken. "You kill me in front of our son's crib?" Josie looked down at the ruined shell of the man she had married. "Death is too quick, Arthur, and I do not want your blood soaking into these floorboards." She walked past him, moving toward the door. Special Agent Hayes and 3 black SUVs from the FBI task force are currently driving up the mountain pass. They will be here in approximately 4 minutes. You have 2 choices. You can resist, and Tommy will put a bullet in your head right now. Or you can walk out the front door, surrender to the federal government, and spend the rest of your natural life in a concrete box at ADX Florence, knowing that I have your money, your men, your city, and your son. Josie paused in the doorway, the golden light of the hallway illuminating her like an avenging angel. "You told Chloe you owned the city, Arthur," Josie said, a final lethal smile gracing her lips. "But you forgot. I am the city." She walked away, the soft padding of her slippers fading into the silence of the massive house. Arthur Costello remained on his knees in the beautifully decorated nursery, listening to the crunch of heavy tires approaching on the snowy driveway outside. He closed his eyes as the red and blue flashing lights finally painted the frosted window panes, ending his world exactly as she had promised. The birth of Carlo Rossi, named in honor of the grandfather whose empire he would one day inherit, was not marked by the traditional fanfare of the Denver underworld. There were no cigars passed around crowded, smoke-filled back rooms, no envelopes of cash discreetly handed to the hospital staff, and no boisterous celebrations at the Costello family's favorite steakhouse on Rush Street. Instead, the arrival of the heir was shrouded in an impenetrable, terrifying silence. Josephine gave birth in the private, heavily fortified wing of Northwestern Memorial Hospital. The entire floor had been secured by a private military contracting firm, discreetly paid through a web of anonymous LLCs. Thomas Rinaldi stood guard outside her suite, a silent sentinel who had effortlessly transitioned from Arthur's loyal captain to Josephine's most trusted general. When the doctor finally emerged to announce the birth of a healthy 8-pound baby boy, Tommy merely nodded, pulled out a heavily encrypted satellite phone, and sent a single, predetermined text message to the commission in New York. "The Rossi bloodline is secure." Within 24 hours of Carlo's birth, the absolute erasure of Arthur Costello from the Denver syndicate was complete. Josie did not return to the Oak Brook estate. That house was a monument to a dead man's ego, tainted by the scent of Chloe Harrington's jasmine perfume and the echoing lies of a failed marriage. Instead, Josie moved into a sprawling multi-level penthouse atop a high-security residential tower in the Gold Coast neighborhood. The residence featured bulletproof glass, a private elevator requiring retinal scans, and a subterranean panic room. It was a fortress disguised as a billionaire's sanctuary. From this glass and steel citadel, while nursing her newborn son, Josephine Rossi went to work. The underworld thrives on momentum, and the sudden power vacuum left by Arthur's spectacular downfall had the potential to plunge Denver into a bloody, protracted war. Liam O'Connor, emboldened by the success of the casino raids he had executed on Josie's behalf, immediately began encroaching on territories that had traditionally belonged to the Italian factions. He moved his extortion rackets into the lucrative construction sites in the West Loop and began heavily taxing the independent bookies operating in the South Side. Liam made a fatal miscalculation. He assumed that because Josephine was a woman and a new mother, she would be too distracted, too soft, or too heavily reliant on Tommy Rinaldi to hold the line. He was summoned to a meeting exactly 12 days after Arthur's arrest. The location was not a dimly lit warehouse or a secluded restaurant backroom. Josie chose the boardroom of a legitimate high-end commercial real estate firm on Wacker Drive, a firm secretly majority-owned by the Rossi Trust. When Liam O'Connor stepped out of the elevator, flanked by 2 hulking enforcers, he was visibly disoriented by the sterile corporate environment. Josie was sitting at the head of a massive, polished mahogany table. She wore a tailored, slate-gray Alexander McQueen suit, her dark hair pulled back into a severe, elegant clasp. She looked nothing like the fragile, heavily pregnant wife Liam's men had briefly observed from afar. She looked like a predator who had just finished digesting a very large meal. Tommy stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the Denver River, projecting a calm, lethal menace. "Mrs. Costello," Liam greeted, a patronizing smirk playing on his lips as he took a seat halfway down the table. "Or should I say, Mrs. Rossi, congratulations on the boy. I expected you'd be resting." "A syndicate does not rest, Liam," Josie replied, her voice smooth, modulated, and entirely devoid of warmth. "And my name is Rossi. You will address me as such." Liam's smirk faltered slightly, but he leaned back, crossing his arms. "Fair enough. Let's talk business, Josephine. My boys took heavy risks burning Arthur's casinos. We lost 2 men in the crossfire with the police. I consider the West Loop construction contracts and the Southside bookies a reasonable compensation for our consulting services." Josie didn't blink. She opened a sleek leather folder resting on the table in front of her. She extracted a single sheet of heavily redacted financial data and slid it across the polished wood until it stopped directly in front of Liam. "What is this?" Liam asked, frowning as he picked up the paper. "That," Josie said softly, "is a summary of the supply chain logistics for your illicit pharmaceutical imports coming through the Canadian border. Specifically, the trucking company you use out of Detroit, the warehouse managers you bribe in Michigan, and the offshore accounts in Belize where you wash the revenue." Liam's face drained of color. The Irish faction's pharmaceutical trade was their primary artery of cash. It was supposed to be completely insulated, entirely disconnected from their street-level operations. "Arthur was a blunt instrument," Josie continued, her eyes locking onto Liam's with the terrifying, unblinking focus of a shark. "He thought power was shouting at men in alleys and shooting rivals in the kneecaps. He didn't understand that true power is entirely invisible. While you were busy taking over 2-bit construction sites and intimidating corner bookies, I spent the last 3 days auditing your entire organization. I own the mortgage on the building where your primary shell company operates. I have the routing numbers for your Belizean accounts." She leaned forward slightly, resting her forearms on the table. "You will pull your men out of the West Loop by midnight. You will refund the taxes you extorted from my Southside bookies, with a 20% penalty for the disrespect. If you step 1 inch outside the boundaries of your designated territory ever again, I will not send men with guns to burn your businesses. I will freeze your assets, seize your supply lines, and hand your logistics directly to the FBI task force. You will be bankrupt and in federal custody before you can even load a weapon. Do we have an absolute understanding, Liam?" The silence in the boardroom was absolute. Liam O'Connor, a man who had built a reputation on sheer, bloody-minded violence, stared at the woman across the table and realized he was entirely outmatched. This wasn't a mobster. This was a corporate raider with the backing of the 5 families and a sociopathic disregard for traditional warfare. "We have an understanding," Liam gritted out, his voice a hoarse whisper. He stood up, leaving the paper on the table, and walked out of the boardroom without looking back. Tommy turned from the window, a rare, genuine smile gracing his weathered face. "Your father would have dragged him out to the Pine Barrens for that level of disrespect." "My father's methods were effective for his era," Josie replied, closing the leather folder. "But blood is expensive to clean up, Tommy. Bankruptcy is much more hygienic." Over the next 6 months, Josie revolutionized the Denver syndicate. She instituted a ruthless corporate structure. Street-level violence was heavily penalized. Disputes were settled through mandatory arbitration mediated by Tommy. She aggressively expanded their legitimate holdings, laundering illicit cash into commercial real estate, tech startups, and boutique hospitality groups. To the outside world, Josephine Rossi was a wealthy, reclusive widow who dedicated her time to philanthropy and raising her son. To the underworld, she was a terrifying, omniscient ghost who ruled the city with a silken, suffocating grip. 2,000 miles away from the glittering skyline of Denver, nestled in the desolate, sun-baked high desert of Colorado, Arthur Costello sat on a concrete slab that served as his bed. The United States Penitentiary, Administrative Maximum Facility ADX, Florence was not designed for rehabilitation. It was designed to slowly, methodically crush the human soul. It was the Alcatraz of the Rockies, a concrete tomb where the most dangerous men in America were buried alive. Arthur's cell was a 7 by 12-foot box of poured concrete. The bed, the desk, the stool, everything was immovable, integrated into the walls. The only window was a 4-inch wide slit near the ceiling, angled perfectly to ensure he could only see a patch of sky, denying him even the visual comfort of the Rocky Mountains. He spent 23 hours a day in this cell. His meals were slid through a small slot in the heavy steel door. His only human contact was the heavily armored guards who occasionally shackled him to strip search his empty room. The physical confinement was brutal, but the psychological torment was a masterpiece of Josephine's design. Arthur's trial had been a spectacular, agonizingly public slaughter. He had initially believed he could beat the charges. He was Arthur Costello, he owned judges, he intimidated juries. But Josie had removed every single piece from his chessboard before the game even began. The federal prosecutor, U.S. Attorney Jonathan Bradley, hadn't needed to rely on shaky witness testimony or circumstantial evidence. He had walked into the federal courthouse armed with Josie's meticulously curated cache of digital annihilation. Bradley presented the encrypted ledgers, proving massive tax evasion and international money laundering. He played the high-definition audio recordings, captured perfectly by Josie's silver compact mirror, of Arthur explicitly ordering the assassination of a union rival and discussing the logistics of the $20 million narcotics shipment. But the final nail in Arthur's coffin had been the star witness, Chloe Harrington. Arthur had watched from the defendant's table, shackled and stripped of his bespoke suits, wearing a bright orange jumpsuit, as his former mistress took the stand. Chloe looked entirely broken. The glamour, the defiance, the intoxicating arrogance that had drawn Arthur to her were completely gone. She had cut a plea deal with the federal government to avoid serving 20 years for accessory to money laundering. In exchange for full immunity and placement in the Witness Protection Program, Chloe sang. She detailed every conversation, every illicit gift, every moment of Arthur's hubris. She wept openly on the stand, not out of remorse for the lives Arthur had destroyed, but out of sheer terror and self-pity. Arthur had received a life sentence plus 85 years, without the possibility of parole. The judge had explicitly recommended ADX Florence due to Arthur's demonstrated capacity to direct violent criminal enterprises from afar. Now, sitting in the suffocating silence of his concrete box, Arthur's mind played the events on an endless, agonizing loop. He was 35 years old. If he lived to be 80, he had 45 years of staring at the same gray walls ahead of him. He was losing his grip on reality. Sometimes, in the dead of night, he thought he could smell the faint scent of expensive jasmine perfume. Other times, he heard the soft, musical cadence of Josie's voice, whispering the exact carat weight of a teardrop diamond. On a Tuesday in late October, exactly 1 year after his incarceration began, the routine of Arthur's purgatory was broken. A guard approached the steel door and unceremoniously slid a manila envelope through the food slot. It hit the concrete floor with a heavy slap. Arthur stared at it for a long time. He received no mail. His remaining blood relatives had publicly disowned him to avoid federal scrutiny. His former associates considered him radioactive. His hands trembled as he picked up the envelope. The return address was a prestigious high-end law firm located in the Willis Tower in Denver. Arthur tore the flap open. Inside, there was a single, thick piece of premium cardstock and a 5x7 glossy photograph. Arthur dropped the envelope and stared at the photograph. It was a picture taken at what appeared to be a lavish christening ceremony. The background featured the ornate, stained glass windows of Holy Name Cathedral in Denver. In the center of the frame stood Josephine. She was breathtaking, dressed in a conservative but stunning white Chanel suit, radiating an aura of serene, untouchable power. Beside her stood Don Domenico Vitiello, the head of the commission, looking down with genuine, grandfatherly affection at the bundle in Josie's arms. And standing directly behind Josie, projecting the protective, commanding presence of a father, was Thomas Rinaldi. In Josie's arms was a beautiful, dark-haired infant boy, dressed in a traditional antique lace christening gown. Arthur's breath hitched in his throat. His son, his heir, the child he had obsessed over, the supposed continuation of the Costello legacy. He flipped the photograph over. Written on the back, in Josie's elegant, flowing script, were 5 words that shattered the final, microscopic fragment of Arthur Costello's sanity. Carlo Arthur Rossi. He thrives. She hadn't just taken his empire, his freedom, and his city. She had completely eradicated his legacy. His son bore the name of the man Arthur had replaced, the man Arthur had quietly viewed as an obsolete relic. She had given the boy Arthur's name solely as a middle name, a permanent, mocking reminder of the weak, foolish king who had lost his throne because he couldn't keep his hands to himself. Arthur dropped the photograph. It fluttered to the concrete floor, landing face up, the image of his victorious wife staring back at him. Arthur backed up until he hit the cold wall of his cell. He slid down, pulling his knees to his chest, and for the first time since the night his world ended, Arthur Costello wept. He wept until his throat was raw, his cries echoing uselessly against the soundproofed concrete, unheard and entirely unmourned by the world he had once believed he owned. 5 years later, the grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel was once again illuminated by the warm, golden glow of thousands of crystal chandeliers. The annual Denver Children's Hospital Charity Gala remained the pinnacle of the city's social calendar. The elite gathered to drink vintage champagne, bid on abstract art, and congratulate themselves on their generosity. The atmosphere, however, was fundamentally different than it had been half a decade prior. There was a palpable sense of order, a quiet, humming discipline that underscored the evening's festivities. The underlying tension of rival syndicates maneuvering in the shadows had vanished. The city was unified under a single, unassailable banner. Josephine Rossi stood near the towering ice sculpture in the center of the room. She was 34, and the intervening years had only sharpened her beauty, turning her into something classical and terrifyingly majestic. She wore a bespoke emerald green gown that perfectly accentuated her poise. She was surrounded by a constellation of the city's most powerful figures. The chief of police laughed at a mild joke she made. The mayor of Denver nodded emphatically at her suggestions regarding urban development. A prominent state senator, the successor to the disgraced Senator Harrington, who had quietly retired following his daughter's scandalous involvement in federal court, was thanking her profusely for the Rossi Foundation's massive grant to the public school system. They all knew who she was. They all knew the rumors, the hushed whispers about the bloodless coup, the absolute destruction of Arthur Costello, and the cold, corporate efficiency with which her holding companies managed the city's less savory industries. But no one dared speak it aloud. Josephine had achieved the holy grail of organized crime. She had made herself entirely indispensable to the legitimate world. She was too wealthy, too connected, and too publicly philanthropic to be touched. Thomas Rinaldi stood a respectful 5 paces behind her, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, scanning the room with the practiced eyes of a man who had survived a lifetime of warfare. He was the sword she rarely needed to draw. "Mrs. Rossi," a smooth voice interrupted the circle of sycophants. Josie turned. It was Jonathan Bradley, the federal prosecutor who had put Arthur in a concrete box. He was now a prominent partner at a white shoe law firm, having leveraged the Costello conviction into a highly lucrative private practice. "Jonathan," Josie smiled warmly, extending a hand adorned with a single, flawless diamond ring. "It's wonderful to see you. How is your wife's gallery doing?" "Thriving, thank you, to your generous patronage," Bradley replied, accepting her hand. He lowered his voice slightly, stepping closer. "I wanted to personally thank you, Josephine. The information your associates provided last week regarding the human trafficking ring operating out of the Gary ports. The federal authorities intercepted them this morning. It was a massive win. Countless lives saved." "I despise that kind of business, Jonathan," Josie said, her voice turning appropriately somber. "It's messy, it's cruel, and it brings unnecessary chaos to our beautiful city. I am always happy to assist law enforcement in removing such parasites from our streets." "You are a true pillar of this community, Mrs. Rossi," Bradley said, nodding deeply before stepping away to fetch a drink. Josie watched him go, a faint, knowing amusement flickering in her dark eyes. The trafficking ring hadn't just been messy. It had been operated by a rogue splinter cell of the Russian mob, attempting to establish a foothold in her territory without paying tribute. Josie had simply outsourced their execution to the federal government. It was cleaner, cost her nothing, and further solidified her reputation as a cooperative, legitimate citizen. "Mama?" Josie turned, the cold calculation vanishing from her eyes instantly, replaced by a fierce, unconditional warmth. Standing before her, holding the hand of his heavily vetted ex-Special Forces nanny, was 5-year-old Carlo Rossi. He was dressed in a miniature tuxedo, his dark hair neatly combed, possessing the striking, sharp features of his grandfather, Carlo, mixed with the undeniable, haunting outline of Arthur. "My handsome boy." Josie knelt down, ignoring the expensive silk of her gown brushing against the floor. She cupped his cheeks, kissing his forehead. "Are you enjoying the party?" "It's loud," Carlo stated seriously, his dark eyes taking in the glittering room. "And everyone keeps looking at you." "They look at me because I am your mother," Josie replied softly, adjusting his small silk bow tie. "And because they know that one day, they will have to look at you." Carlo tilted his head, a gesture so eerily reminiscent of Arthur that it made Tommy, standing nearby, shift his weight. "Uncle Tommy says we own the hotel." Josie smiled, casting a brief, affectionate glance up at her enforcer. "Uncle Tommy is simplifying things, Carlo. We do not own the hotel. We own the holding company that manages the real estate trust that leases the land to the hotel developers. Do you understand the difference?" The 5-year-old frowned, trying to process the complex corporate structure. "No." "That's perfectly fine," Josie laughed, a light musical sound that belonged solely to her son. "You have plenty of time to learn. But remember this, Carlo. Always remember what I am telling you right now." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a quiet, intense whisper meant only for him. "People will tell you that true power is making people fear you. They will tell you that a king rules with a heavy hand. They are wrong, and those men always end up locked away in the dark or bleeding out in the rain. True power is making people believe they need you. True power is controlling the board so completely that your enemies defeat themselves before you ever have to make a move." Carlo nodded slowly, his young mind absorbing the weight of his mother's doctrine. "Like a game of chess?" "Exactly like chess, my love," Josie whispered, standing back up and taking his small hand in hers. She looked out over the crowded ballroom, at the politicians, the judges, the mobsters disguised as businessmen, all dancing to the silent tune she composed. Josephine Rossi had been underestimated once. She had been treated as a fragile vessel, a pretty ornament to be locked away in a golden cage while arrogant men played with fire. She had burned their world to ash and built an indestructible empire upon the ruins. She was the matriarch, the architect, the undisputed Queen of Denver. And as she squeezed her son's hand, she knew with absolute certainty that no one would ever make the mistake of underestimating her bloodline again. Josephine Rossi's chilling transformation from a betrayed pregnant wife into the untouchable matriarch of a criminal empire proves one absolute truth. The most dangerous weapon in the world is a brilliant mind that has nothing left to lose. Arthur Costello thought he controlled the game, but he never realized his wife was the one designing the board. If this slow-burn tale of meticulous revenge, mafia politics, and psychological warfare kept you on the edge of your seat, we need your support to bring more of these intense, high-stakes stories to life. Please like this video to help the algorithm find other drama lovers, share it with friends who appreciate a masterclass in vengeance, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next descent into the dark, thrilling world of power and betrayal. Drop a comment below. Did Arthur deserve his fate, or was Josie too ruthless? Let us know.